All right. Welcome back to the God Project. My name is Brian Nicholson. Today I'm joined with Pete Lash and Wes Duvall. We're going to talk about the philosophy of mind. It's an area Pete and I are complete amateurs in, hence the channel title. But Wes has recently submitted a paper on why he thinks physicalism is compatible with qualia, or mental states, specifically what it's like to be something. And there are lots of philosophers out there who argue that mind is not reducible to matter. So we're excited to hear his arguments for why he disagrees with those people. Wes, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about yourself, how you got introduced to this subset of philosophy, and then Pete, sorry, you can introduce yourself too, and then.
Yeah, no, I'm Pete Lash, and you guys have seen me before, so.
Yeah, we can probably stop introducing ourselves at this point because we got a rock solid audience base.
Got a fan base.
Yes, of which I'm a member.
There we go. Moving on up in the ranks. But yeah, Wes, you can introduce yourself and then kind of just provide a general outline for what you're trying to demonstrate in your paper.
Yes, I'm Wes Duvall. I originally became interested in philosophy in pursuit of what I think a lot of people sort of begin with philosophy also in pursuit of, and that's certainty, or at least something close to certainty within moral philosophy. I'm still interested in moral philosophy, but as I started studying it, I realized rather quickly that I couldn't have any explanatory strength in my discussion of moral philosophy, especially moral knowledge, without discussing and learning for myself how knowledge in general works. So I knew I had to study epistemology beforehand, and eventually philosophy of mind, because I have the conviction that epistemology is very dependent on mentality and mental objects. And that was the best decision for me in terms of philosophy, because I have a history with wine and spirits and that sort of thing. And so I've been sort of training myself for years, since I was like 17 or 18, to taste and detect and categorize and memorize very elusive and delicate subjective experiences.
You were trying to become a master sommelier?
I started that way. Actually, I started to learn how to be a winemaker.
Okay.
So I was a vigneron in Provence for almost a year, and at a couple of different vineyards. And then I realized that was too lonely. It's 14 hours, 15 hours a day of just being in a tractor, tending to vines for most of the year before and after harvest.
Mm.
And then I wanted to be a master sommelier. I'd have to go up the levels, of course. I ended up giving that up because I didn't really enjoy the restaurant industry that I was working at afterwards. But I've always maintained this love of wine and spirits. Right now, I actually teach classes on wine tasting. So that's my day job. But I because of this, I take subjective experience very, very seriously. And I feel like I have to, given what I'm interested in. And so when I started to discover more about philosophy of mind and problems related to consciousness, it was of enormous attraction.
Sure. What would you say are some of like the, I guess, biggest competing views within like someone who's a physicalist and then someone who thinks that mind is not reducible to matter? How do those different kinds of people approach questions of epistemology broadly, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it depends.
That way.
Sorry,
you said you had mentioned that concerns about moral epistemology led you back to the philosophy of mind.
Well, I think when it comes to reducibility with mind, it depends a lot on one's framework approaching consciousness. So there's a bunch of different options. There are functionalists of different kinds. There are dualists of different kinds. There are eliminativists and illusionists. Over the past couple of decades, panpsychism has been very, very, very popular. And I don't consider myself any of these at all. But they tend to dominate. And so depending on who you see yourself to be, you're going to approach knowledge differently. And I think the most important factor within those different methodologies is how you approach subjectivity and objectivity and the divide therein.
Okay.
So I think that if you believe that consciousness is more than physical, you're likely to believe that that it's somewhat non-reducible, that there's a subjectivity that can't be reduced to objective physics, and you're also likely to believe that functionalism fails to account for that subjectivity.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Okay, so what are your beefs with Chalmers and his crew?
I don't have a huge beef. So I agree that there is subjective experience. I agree that for many that there's a problem with the physicalist thesis that everything is reducible to physics, or if not that, because you can be a non-reductive physicalist, that at least physics accounts for everything that exists.
Mm-hmm.
And that being in conflict with subjective experience has been debated for a long, long time. For longer than Nagel in the 70s, but his paper certainly made it very popular. So in
what is it like to be a bat?
Exactly. In 74, he himself offered something it's like to be an organism as a definition for consciousness. And over the decades, that is still held to be an important factor of consciousness, but it's no longer a definition of consciousness per se. For example, Snowden in 2010 had a paper, Paul Snowden, talking about how if you read that one way, something is conscious. If there's something it's like to be it, then it's trivial. And if you read it the opposite way, if there's something it's like to be you, then you're conscious, then it's just false. And the reason he argues that is, if you're conscious and there's something it's like to be you, it's just trivially true that every conscious thing, there's something, you don't know exactly what that something is. You don't even know how to approach it, but at least there's something it's like to be something conscious. But arguing that there being something it's like, therefore you're conscious, is dubitable. He talks about, in fact, Snowden believes it's just false. You can't equate consciousness with something it's like, because he argues, for example, that you can talk about what it's like to be buried in certain places. Like, hey, what is it like to be a dead person in San Francisco? And there's a meaning to that sentence that's not self-contradictory. You're talking about essentially, what do you expect corpses to be treated, whether they're to be buried a certain way with, certain rites as corpses, that sort of thing. And yet we would not say that corpses are conscious. Right. That's debatable, but at least he argues that, it could be argued that you can't equate those two. Luckily, people realized that before him. So Chalmers, for example, and many people, Ned Block, for example, also had two different distinctions between different kinds of consciousness. So Ned Block talks about A consciousness and P consciousness, where A consciousness is short for access consciousness. That's basically information processing. And then P consciousness is when an A conscious state also has something it's like to be it. And then David Chalmers very similarly argued that, there are easy problems for explaining consciousness, and that you can explain how information is integrated, how it's accessed. You can measure information in the brain. You can talk about memory and explain that. But then the hard problem of consciousness, capitalized, is the problem of explaining the something it's like to be a conscious being. So they all borrow from Nagel, but they don't equate in the way Nagel did consciousness with something it's like. I agree with them, by the way, that there is something it's like to be conscious, that that's a subjective experience, and that it's difficult for physicalists to explain. I think it's impossible for many physicalists to explain. But I think if you accept the argument that I have in my paper, which draws on convictions in identity theory and information theory, then I think that they're not only compatible, but entailed.
So going back to the A consciousness and P consciousness, you said the P consciousness is the state plus what it's like to be in that state. Is that correct? Or
it can be. That's how most people read it. I think Ned has argued before that you can be in a P conscious state. I should have explained. P conscious is short for phenomenal consciousness. Ned may still argue, I know he's argued in the past, that you can have a P conscious state without an A conscious state, but most people would disagree with that. And not everyone, but most physicalists at least would disagree with that. Ned Block, for example, is a physicalist, just a non-reductive physicalist. And most would say that you need to have at least some A consciousness and P consciousness if you're having P consciousness.
Okay. So would you mind explaining for the audience why something like, Mary the color scientist, what is that thought experiment?
I'm not hearing you.
What's up?
I'm not hearing you.
Oh. Can you hear me at all now?
No.
I can hear you. Can you hear me, Wes?
Hang
on.
I'm not hearing.
Yeah, hang on.
Let me remove my... Oh, I got you now.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep. I'm
Okay.
sorry about that.
No, you're good. So my question is, can you explain for the audience what someone who presents Mary the color scientist, for example, what are they trying to show? How does that demonstrate this phenomena of qualia, and how does it show that it's potentially irreducible? And how would you respond to that? I think you touch on that in the paper.
Yeah. So that, for those who aren't aware, was presented by Frank Jackson in the early 80s. And he called it his knowledge argument. And I think it's actually the most convincing argument for qualia. And he uses Mary as one example. The idea of Mary in the colorless room is that she is a super scientist, let's say, who knows all the facts about psychophysics and psychology and color science, and yet she lives in a colorless room for her whole life, studying from a colorless monitor, let's say, and eventually she knows all the facts about color vision. But if she were to exit her room, then she would learn something new, something that couldn't have been communicated to her as a fact from her studies. And another argument within the knowledge argument, or another, not argument, but analogy that I think is actually more powerful than Mary's is Fred. And Fred is, in the same paper, is a person who has the ability to discern a color that nobody else in the world can perceive, right? So there's red 1, let's say, and he perceives red 2, and everyone else can only perceive red 1. And the argument is that it doesn't matter how detailed the observations of Fred are, whether it's under laboratory conditions or a full descriptive length of everything that goes on in his brain and his context and his history, the functions being carried out. We can't know what he experiences when he experiences that color that we can't perceive. We don't know what it's like, what the difference is for him between red 1 and red 2. And I think what these two arguments illustrate is that something that it's like, that is hinted to, is private and ineffable. So it's something that only the person experiencing it can access, and that they can't transmit that information through communication. So whether you're Mary and you're reading it from a monitor, or whether you're a scientist running experiments on Fred, you can't access the information he's accessing. You can't have the experiences he's experiencing, and you can't describe those. He can't describe those. Mary can't describe those. And so this privacy and ineffability are the two most important factors. I think they're the most important consequences that come from accepting that there is something it's like to be conscious. And I should say that the problem with those two, in terms of reconciling that with physics, is that most people who consider themselves physicalists would argue that not only does physics account for everything that exists, but that everything that falls within the domain of physics is describable in a third-person objective, public way. And so the reason it might not be, the reason people who aren't me would argue that the subjective, the private, the ineffable aren't reducible is because they're in different domains. You can't reduce the private to the public. You can't reduce the subjective to the objective. I think you can, but people would argue otherwise.
Okay, so to make sure I'm understanding that, are you saying that such a description, like for Mary, for instance, such a description is possible? It seems possible to have a full knowledge of red based on, like you're explaining what she's reading off of a black and white monitor. But I mean, are you arguing that it's possible for that to translate into like a true understanding of what it looks like to see red? Like, does the physicalist have to argue that, or I'm not sure?
I don't think so. I think that a lot of physicalists do think so. And that's part of the novelty of my argument. If it clears things up, and I think it might, if you were to summarize my view, or at least give it a theme, you can think of me as Daniel Dennett flipped on his head. So I would accept a lot of Dennett's claims that a phenomenal experience is just an instance of information processing. And I would accept that the brain is an analytic engine, is an engine of information processing. And I would agree with his descriptions of such things as, multiple drafts and global workspace, etc. But where I disagree with Dennett, and it's probably the most important part, is Daniel Dennett would argue and has argued that when people talk about subjective experience, that he would say that subjective experience doesn't exist because all information is actually objective information about the objective world, if it's real information, if it's not improperly processed, which we make errors in our processing. But he would argue that there's objective information alone. There's no subjective information. I argue quite the opposite, that actually all information has to be subjectively processed, that it's under very tight constraints by the physical world and by our convictions within topics like information theory and within, most importantly, with identity theory.
I think I would agree with you on that. I mean, to say we're using like an objective basis for determining how the world operates, like that seems to be relying on your subjective understanding of what the world actually looks like. I don't know if that makes sense. But that seems to be like a foundation, at least like whether it's a scientific experiment or what have you, like it seems to be relying on the perceptions of the scientists conducting the experiment, which seems to be subjective. So I think I'm agreeing with you and understanding you.
I agree. I think that the most common flaw in a lot of philosophers is chewing more than they're allowed to bite off. You know, we like to imagine that not just am I thinking about something, but it's possible for you to think of the exact same thing and for us to have the exact same thought. But you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't both accept that you can have objective thoughts and that those thoughts are intrinsically subjective. And I've always intuitively accepted that I can't access other minds. Like many people intuitively see that there's a real problem in the problem of other minds. But I think I take it radically far in a good way. But you can argue that it's too radical for some people. But I think that the reason that I give justifies that it's actually the case that my brain processes completely different information than either of your brains, and vice versa.
Yeah, so I guess I have a question. So everyone's brain processes information subjectively, right? Independent of everybody else. So I guess how would you define objective information then? What is objective? Does it even exist in that point?
Yes. You just have to be careful about not having an ambiguity. So John Searle, for example, illustrated a nice matrix between subjectivity and objectivity, where he talked about how there's an epistemologically subjective and an ontologically subjective, and there's an ontological subjective and an ontological objective. So we can know things subjectively and we can know things objectively, and things exist subjectively and they exist objectively. So so Searle would say that Brian's hat exists objectively, independent of any of us being here or observing it, and that we can all see it, and we can objectively see that hat is there on Brian's head. And so we have objective knowledge of that hat, and it exists objectively. But then Searle would also say that, say, Pete could think, but not say, for it would be rude, that he doesn't like that hat. And that would be a subjective knowledge that Pete has an opinion, essentially, on the hat. And that we all, in seeing the hat, have subjective qualities of the hat that exist, like a subjective quality of orange or blue, etc. And so those are the sort of explanations that Searle gives. I disagree with them a little bit, and I would actually slice off two of those. So in my view, everything that exists objectively. So that hat exists objectively. My computer exists objectively. We all exist objectively. And yet there's no epistemological objectivity, in that we do not each have the exact same knowledge, objective knowledge, but that we have access to this objectively existent thing subjectively. So we have subjective knowledge about objectively existing things.
Gotcha.
If that makes
Okay.
sense. And that for me, subjective knowledge is not opinion, as Searle would phrase it. I would say that subjective knowledge is just privately accessed knowledge. That it's still true or false. I would say if its knowledge is true, among other things, but that it's privately accessed.
Sure.
Okay. That makes more sense.
That seems like a coherent view to me.
Perhaps I can offer how I get to this stage.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead and present your case. That'd be awesome.
There's two main subjects that I'm going to talk about, and I have to introduce them separately. The first and the most important is concerning identity theory. And this is not personal identity. So I'm not talking about how we have identities through time. I'm talking about sort of logical concepts of identity. And for example, like Noonan and Curtis have an article in the encyclopedia, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, where they talk about this. If you look up identity there, they sort of explain this, but I can explain it as well, that in philosophy, when it comes to identity, we have really two different concepts of it. Something can be qualitatively identical, or it can be numerically identical. And if it's numerically identical, then we would say that two names actually refer to one thing. So we would say, to use Frege, this famous Fregen analogy, we would say the morning star and the evening star are numerically identical because they both are the same thing. They're both talking about the planet Venus. But when we're talking about qualitatively identical things, we're talking about things like two different cars that are the same model, or two copies of the same book. And so a qualitatively identical idea would be another example I could give was that two dogs are qualitatively identical, not just because they look the same, but because, and this is what Noonan and Curtis describe, and this is accepted by most philosophers, the reason they're qualitatively identical is because they share at least one property. So in the case of a Chihuahua and a Doberman, they both have the property of being a dog, and so they're qualitatively identical in that sense, even though they look very different. And that something can't be numerically identical unless every single property on, we could say, both sides of the ledger are there. So unless every fact about A is also a fact of B, and to the extent that that's not the case, even if it looks indistinguishable, if there's one property askew, then they can't be numerically identical. They have to be qualitatively identical, if they're identical at all.
Right.
So once it's explained, it's relatively easy to understand. What I argue is actually that the whole concept of qualitative identity is unjustified and self-contradictory. And that seems rather radical, but the logic for that is that if I were to present it the way I do in my paper, imagine that you have two objects, and we're going to say that these two objects are qualitatively identical because there are two properties that correspond to each object, A and B, properties A and B, and there's property A of one object and property B of a different object, and we're arguing that these two properties are numerically identical. So we would say that those two objects share the same property, but the property just goes by two different names, A and B, but it's the same. What we're arguing, or we're tentatively suggesting. I would say, or I wouldn't just present this. I have a conviction that if we acknowledge that the objects to which these properties are attributes, if they're only qualitatively identical and not numerically identical, then we're implicitly acknowledging that there's something different about these two objects, that there's a third property, say property Q, that is a property of one that's not a property of the other. Because again, if there wasn't a third property, if there was only those two that was actually numerically identical, then they would be the same object, but there has to be something different about them. So there has to be that third property Q. And it doesn't matter for our thought experiment, because I'm trying to make this as simple as possible, to apply to as many different beliefs as possible. You can be a Platonist and argue this. You can be an Aristotelian and argue this. I happen to not be either of those, but say that you have those two objects, property A of object 1, property B of object 2, and then you have property Q that is, say, a property of object 2. So then there's a fact there. There's a fact that property Q is a property of the object of which property B is also an object, is also a property of. So property Q and B are both properties of the same object. That's the fact. Property Q and B are properties of the same object. But that means that property B can't be identical to property A, because property Q is not a property of the same object that property A is a property of. Because if it was, then property Q would apply to both objects and we'd be back to them being numerically identical. So we acknowledge that property Q is not a property of one object, but it is a property of the other. So there's a fact of property Q and B that's not a fact of property A. And therefore this fact does not apply to both A and B. And therefore A and B cannot be numerically identical, because not all the facts apply to both of them. And so if both property A and property B are not identical, then neither of their objects are. If they're qualitatively identical by virtue of A and B being numerically identical. Do you have any did I explain that well, or there's some questions?
I think so. I mean, I probably need to go back over that one more time. We don't have to do that now, obviously, but
yeah. So basically, I guess the point is that the qualitative identity doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah. There's a good I could use. So that's the most general logician's way of putting it. But
I just want to make sure I'm not missing it. Yeah.
Yeah. Intuitively, we could talk about, say, two white Toyota Corollas in front of a house, right? And one is parked in the driveway, and one is parked in the street. And someone comes to me and he says, these two Toyota Corollas are qualitatively identical. They're not the same Toyota Corolla, but they have the same property in that they're both white,
right?
Let's say, or they're both Corollas, or they're both Toyotas. Doesn't matter which property this person chooses. They could pick any out, and then I could say, and I would say, that can't be the case, because if we take the property that they adhere to, say whiteness of the Toyota Corolla, then I would say, well, this whiteness of the Toyota Corolla in the driveway is closer to me in proximity, let's say in geometric length, than the whiteness of the Toyota Corolla in the street. That you can always point to a property that's different, whether it's a geometric property or whether it's a mechanical property, and you can say that there's a fact there, and that this fact skews it. That you can't use, and we do, unfortunately, use language to deceive ourselves into thinking that we're just talking about whiteness, but really there's a fact of the whiteness, just like there's a fact of the car to which the whiteness belongs.
Gotcha.
And so this applies in every instance that you can think of, even if you're talking about abstract objects.
Okay, so someone would say that the whiteness of both Corollas has that they're qualitatively identical, but you're saying because I can point out a difference between the whiteness of one Corolla versus the whiteness of the other Corolla, that demonstrates that there is no qualitative identicality, if that's a word. Is that
that it doesn't. That it's actually false.
Right.
That there's not that justification there.
Sure.
Now, I acknowledge shortly after I laid that out that, for example, Poincaré, famous mathematician, once said famously that mathematics is the art of giving the same name to different things. I acknowledge that we have to use terms to refer to different things. We have to use sort of qualitative descriptions. We have to use universals to describe multiple things. So what I say to account for that is I offer a different way of thinking about properties that works within logic. By the way, I should have mentioned earlier that most logicians don't really employ qualitative identity anyways. They usually use numerical identity because it's easier to quantify. But within the description of properties, I could say, instead of defining a property as just an attribute of an object, I could say that a property that, let's call it X. X is an attribute of object Y. And if I knew everything about X, then I would know necessarily that X is an attribute of Y, then it's a property. So if knowing everything about this means that I know where it to which object it adheres, then I can call it a property. But if I know everything about it and don't know what the object to which it applies is, or if it doesn't even have an object to which it applies, then it's not a property. It's just what I would call an aspect. And so, for example, and the example I give in my paper is blueness. So we can talk about blueness, and most people would say that blueness is a property. I would argue that blueness is not a property in itself, because if I offered blueness as a property and you asked me to tell you every fact of blueness, and I described them to you, and you still didn't know if I was talking about blueness of my shirt or blueness of a lavender flower, then it wouldn't be a property. It would just be an abstract aspect. It would be an aspect that I abstract from the information that I access from actual real properties of real objects. But if I said blueness of surface Y at time t accessed from point E, then that's enough information where if you knew what time it was and where I was and what I was looking at, then you would know that I'm talking about blueness of a flower pot on my table. Then that would be a property, because you would know exactly what object that applies to, and you would know that that's a property and attribute of that object.
Gotcha.
So I believe that every time we get information about something, that we're accessing an actual property of an actual object. But when we're talking vaguely, when we're using language to communicate with each other, most of the time we're talking in aspectual terms, so that we all kind of get the gist, because we have similar systems of information processing.
Okay.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, that makes
Yeah.
sense. How does that lead into
Yeah, I think I got it.
this case?
So if you accept that, which I think you have to, but if you accept it, then what that means is that every property is limited. It has to be numerically identical to itself, that is. It has to be numerical. It can't be qualitatively identical to anything else. Every property is constrained by its physical, by its geometric and mechanical context. And what that means is that when we talk about information processing systems, that the information accessed has to be unique in every case. That the information that if information is dependent on some kind of physical process to bring it about, say like a computer or a nervous system, then that information accessed is dependent on those physical events. And if every physical event is not identical with another one, then no information is identical with other information.
Okay, I think that makes
Let
sense.
me, yeah. So for example, if you and I are sitting side by side and we're looking at a potted plant, we're looking at the same object, but there are different photons reflecting from the plant and being absorbed by the cone cells in my retina and in your retina. And so we have different channels. Also, the surfaces that those photons are reflecting off of are different surfaces of the same object. And that our nervous systems are different nervous systems. So even though we're looking at the same object, and we can even talk about it as the same object, we're accessing different information about that object.
Okay. And if we're accessing different information about that object, that implies that there is no qualitative identicalness between, I guess,
my subjective is, like between
that
my
there's no public identity there. There's no objective information being processed by both of us, that we're not sharing information, that we have totally different information. The reason, by the way, that I would argue that you can still talk about the same object is if we talk about objects as sets of elements. So we have object A, and there are different properties within that set. So property B, C, D, E, et cetera, we can talk about that same object as a set where B and C are properties that you access, and D and E are properties that I access. I don't need to access A and B, and you don't need to access, I don't need to access B and C, and you don't need to access D and E, as long as we agree that those properties are all properties of the object within which they're captured as elements in a set, then we can talk about the same object. So that's kind of complicated, but my purpose for wording it that way is to be able to escape idealism, because otherwise we would be restricted to not even idealism, but solipsism. We would be restricted to we would only be able to talk about the objects of our minds. But because I think that objects exist objectively, and it's just the knowledge we have of them is subjective, then we can talk about the same objects, even though we have different knowledge of those objects. And that's actually, I think, how science progresses.
Okay.
Yeah, there's questions like kind of bubbling up in the old noodle right now that like are not coherent at all. So that's fascinating. Pete, did you have any inquiries?
I'm following along. So
Yeah, kind of doing the same.
The purpose of talking about information here is, I think, because we mentioned before that I think that consciousness is reducible, and like all things that are reducible, I am convinced that it's gradually reducible. So it's not like it's an emergent process that's not a sudden emergence. It gradually emerges, and by that I mean that all of the information that's processed is, like we said earlier, unique and anomalous to its physical circumstances. But we can trace information processing from very fundamental systems. So we can talk about like the micro or macromolecules genetically, and we can. I apologize for using a cliche sort of layer cake reductionist analogy, but we can sort of go up levels and talk about how that information persists. And it might be too complicated to talk about it here, but if you're interested in how we can track that in a reductionist paradigm, then I would suggest looking up the work by John Collier, who is a South African professor who's talked about how information goes up levels. So I think I would specifically recommend a 2003 paper by him, where he talks about how we can talk about that. So we know that information can be processed on the level of, on the macroscopic level of the level that you and I are all participating in easily, and that information can be processed on the cell level or even lower and lower. It's certain that it's lower. And so we know that if this information is unique to every event, and that we can describe information processing from the brain, and that information can't be identical between systems, then we're necessarily inclined to believe, to at least commit to, a privacy to that information and an ineffability of that information, because you can't just communicate what your brain processes, because that would just be you emitting different physical forces, say, that would be imposing themselves on a different person's nervous system, and he would be getting different information from that. That it's new information. Every time you perceive information, it's new information. And so I can't describe to you what it's like for me to look at a flower pot, but I still nonetheless access information about that flower pot, and that it's physical information about that flower pot, but it's private to myself and I can't communicate it. And so this privacy ineffability, which we started this discussion talking about being in conflict with physicalism, I think is actually entailed by it once you accept that qualitative identities cannot exist, or at least can't be true. You know, people can obviously talk about qualitative identities, but they can't be true qualitative identities, I believe. And if they were true, then things like zombies could exist. Not zombies in the undead sense, but zombies in the very popular sense of something that can process the same information you process, but without the subjective experience. So the thought experiment is that there could be a person who walks around as, say, my companion, and this zombie sees the things that I see, the objects that I see, and talks the way I talk. And granted that it doesn't have numerically identical information to what I have, I mean, everyone would accept that. It doesn't have the exact same experience that I have because it's a different person. But as long as there could be qualitative identities, we could say that there's some information that it processes that's identical to mine, that there are some properties of what it processes that's identical to what I process, and that identical information would be public because circumstance is irrelevant. It could be a zombie or it could be another person from a different scenario also perceiving something qualitatively identical to what I perceive. And if it's public, then there's no point for it to be private. If there's something that could be public information, then why do we have private information, private experience, as some would say? And that's why that zombie argument is so it's so difficult to refute, because we're talking within a mindset that we all have been intuitively accepting, that it's possible to have the same type of experience. And if you can have the same type of experience, then why bother with private experience? But if there's no information that's identical between either the zombie or myself, that there's nothing that it can access, no property that it can access that's identical to the properties that I access, because there's a different time and a different place, a different, let's see, if it's, for example, in seeing, it's looking at a different angle than I am. It's processing different light rays than I am, and at a different time than I am, and a different surface than I am. If all of the information is different in every sense, then there's nothing that's identical between the zombie and myself. And that means that there's no public information, that there's no objective information being processed. And if there's no objective information being processed, then all the information is subjective to begin with. And the zombie argument crumbles because from the beginning, we talk about the zombie as something that doesn't process subjectively. And so that's why I agree with Chalmers and Bloch that we have subjective experience, but I disagree that that entails something that's non-physical. And I would argue that the zombie argument fails. And I would explain arguments like Mary by saying that when Mary's sitting in her colorless room, she's getting different information when she's reading words on the screen than the information she's processing when she walks out of her room. And so, of course, she's going to have a new experience because she's observing new data. And Fred is processing data on a color spectrum that we're not allowed to process by the limitations in our own optical system. You know, we only have 3 types of cones: blue, green, red. And let's say that Fred has an extra cone cell, so he can process this different information. And so, no matter how much we study Fred, we're observing we're accessing the information that our systems are capable of accessing, and he's accessing something totally different. And so, of course, we can't know what it's like for him to see red because we don't have the information he accesses. We only have the information that we can access.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm probably not going to articulate this question very well, but like when I think of the concept of an objective world, and like an object within that objective world, I'm
really sorry, but your voice cut out again.
So my bad. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Not hearing anything.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm hearing both of y'all.
Okay.
No.
Did you hear anything, Wes?
I think it's on his end.
No.
I don't have my mic plugged in today, but the built-in mic hasn't given me problems before.
Yeah, I mean, I've never used the mic, but
I mean, it does look more sophisticated. You hearing me now? Oh, now I can't hear him.
Nope, we can't hear him.
Obviously, we're the voice of reasons here, so all that matters is that you can hear us. Can you hear us? I'm just kidding. Oh, he's, yeah. It's a fun little game of whose line is it anyway? Oh, he's muted. He's muted here.
Yeah.
It's not letting me type in the chat box. Can you type in the chat box and say, can you unmute yourself? Hang on. I'm going to try and sign language this.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, I can't hear you.
Yeah, we can't hear you, man.
Yeah, you're muted. Are you able to type in the chat, Pete?
Yeah, I just typed right now.
Okay. I don't see anything. It's weird. Oh, private chat. There it is. I think you're muted, Wes. Yeah.
Can he hear us?
Yeah, he said he can hear us.
So your mic is muted. Hang on.
Better?
Yeah. There
There
you
we
go.
go.
Okay. I'm sorry for that, gentlemen.
No, you're fine.
Okay, no worries.
All good in the hood. Okay, so yeah, how I understand an objective world is like if we talk about an object in the objective world, it seems coherent to me for us to refer to something and then consider that thing the same object, even if like our experiences of that object aren't identical. But it seems like your view doesn't, and maybe I'm not understanding, but it seems like your view doesn't allow for us to refer to that thing as the same object. We might do it like colloquially, but like when we actually look into it, it seems like we can't actually call it the same object. Am I understanding that correctly? Or
I would say you can call it the same object, and in fact, you are perceiving the same object, but you're perceiving different properties of it.
okay.
So you're perceiving it differently in every circumstance. And so it kind of, I should probably talk a little bit about what I'm talking about when it comes to information, because you can talk about information, at least semantic information that's about something. You can talk about it two different ways. You can talk about it as being natural or non-natural. By natural information, we're talking about information that is accessed by virtue of natural laws, of physical laws, of physical events. And when we talk about non-natural information, we're talking about information that's accessed linguistically. So we can talk about communicating information. And actually, in the Routledge book, 2016 book on information, there's a chapter by Piccinini and Scarantino where they have a great sentence summarizing the difference between those. They say natural information is about what smoke carries about fire, whereas the information in non-natural information is information about what sentences like "there is smoke" carry about smoke.
Mm-hmm.
So in one case, it's physical processes, and in the other case, it's a relation between descriptions and things. And I take the former case. I argue that, in my view, all information that can be quantified, all information that can be subject to experimentation and modeling has to be natural information. There's a lot of debate on this, but unless you're willing to offer a unified theory of information, which is famously people are cynical about, then you have to pick a side there. And in my paper, I at least say we should at least lean towards the natural information view, because if you're going to argue that there's some experience that's ineffable, then you're committing yourself to the view that you can have some information that can't be communicated. So if you're going to take a non-natural view, if you're going to take a linguistic view, then you're shooting yourself in the foot, because you're ultimately denying ineffability of subjective experiences, which you can do. There are plenty of physicalists who argue that subjective experience doesn't exist. Those would be eliminativists, and they're totally okay with holding a non-natural view of information, talking about how words refer to things. But if you believe that qualia are things that can be described, that, or at least that qualia is something to consider, that a qualia is something to talk about, then you're admitting that there's some information that you can't communicate that is, by definition, ineffable. And so
Mm.
any kind of grounding in non-natural information would be insufficient to account for that. But if you argue that information is natural, that it can only be processed by physical mechanisms, and there's a lot of data to confirm this. I gesture toward the past 4 or 5 decades on robotics. If you view that mechanisms process information and that's necessary for information, then you're committed, I think, again, if you agree with my refutation of qualitative identity, then you're committed to the view that the information processed by physical mechanisms are limited by those physical mechanisms. And so you can still talk about the same objects. You can still process information about the same objects because, again, they exist objectively.
Right.
There or not. But that it's different in every case. And that's why I don't have access to your information. You don't have access to mine.
So that goes back to the ontological objectivity and then epistemic subjectivity, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Gotcha.
Well, I've got a lot to think about.
I know that this is the God project, and so I would say that I'm not arguing against theism. Really, I'm arguing against dualism, panpsychism. I'm not a functionalist, because to be a functionalist, you have to be committed to the view that any two systems operating what we would call the same function are having the same are having the same information. And I don't agree that that's the case. And I'm not an eliminativist, because I think everything within your experience can be described in physical means. And so I'm arguing against those. But if you happen to be someone for whom the argument of immaterial minds does a lot of the heavy lifting for your credence towards theism over atheism, then this is something to consider.
Absolutely. Yeah. I did
sense.
want to ask, like, if just for my own sake, really, like, if you have introductory papers, maybe going into like a little more detail about the different views, like eliminativism, that you would recommend, or books.
I think so, because I think that that you can read something like Dan Dennett's book, Consciousness Explained. Although, just because he does a great job of describing information processing in a layman's vocabulary, and that's the best introduction to that, specifically to the theory of the brain as something that computes information. But of course, I disagree with him on an enormous number of the conclusions he makes in those books, like the qualia are completely not worth talking about. I also, by the way, would disagree with him that memes are real. I don't believe in memes. I think memes are a mistaken concept. And so there's a lot of stuff that.
Yeah,
sorry?
you don't mean internet memes, right?
No. By memes, I mean thoughts.
Yeah.
Say that it's information that's just out there, that's waiting to be processed, and that multiplies itself by being processed. So it's the sort of cultural version of genes, and I don't believe that's the case. I'm not convinced by that whatsoever. So I would say, if you're looking to sort of understand a physicalist or naturalist view of the brain as an information processing system, introductory wise, I would look at Dan Dennett's works. But it's also really helpful to just look up YouTube videos about information theory. And I found, and I don't know why I don't hear this by anyone else, but if you're getting into a subject that you're not comfortable in already, the best thing you can do is to find the people who essentially established those disciplines or that subject and read the first papers or first books that they wrote, because necessarily they're writing for an audience that's new to the stuff they're talking about. And they have to write in a way that people who don't think like them are thinking. And so I would suggest reading early papers by Nyquist and Hartley back in the 1920s. They were the people who sort of began information theory. Later, Claude Shannon very famously talked about like information entropy and talked about that advanced that in a different way. These folks, even though it's pretty mathematically dense, that's your best way to get even closer, even more advanced in thoughts about information.
Sure.
And ultimately, people like Kolmogorov and algorithmic information theory and Turing, these guys basically brought the concept of information as something belonging to communication into the realm of computers and machines. And it's really important to know about how complexity relates to information, especially to get the most cohesive understanding of what I'm arguing, because in terms of information theory and in terms of like Kolmogorov information, it's all about how even though there's an infinite amount of information in the world, that information that you process or that a machine processes is limited by the simplicity, the schemas, or the systems that access that information. And so that is even more in line with sort of the direction that I'm going. And so if you're looking into it that way, that's probably those sort of folks would be people that I'd suggest reading into. I think Khan Academy also has a super great introduction to information theory.
Nice. Okay.
I love Khan Academy.
Yeah.
Pete, did you have any questions for Wes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that covers it. I mean, I didn't understand everything, but I got enough to like know where you're going with it. So
yeah, I'm surprised I understood as much as I did.
Yeah, I was following along, but I think I got it. So
to the extent that you understand me is something I take pride in, and to the extent that you don't is something that I can work on. Next time.
I mean that's something that I need to sharpen up and get smarter on. So
I don't know who said. I think it was Einstein who said that the measure of a genius is how simply they can explain. No, I'm sorry. That was yes, that was the other physicist. Yeah.
Awesome.
Sweet. Well, this was one of our more heady discussions, just because the topic is so foreign to both of us.
Yeah.
But we learned a ton and appreciate you coming on. Hopefully we can have you on in the future. Best of luck in getting the paper published. And
Thank you.
Yeah, sounds like you got a lot to talk about and a lot to share. So I can definitely imagine us getting you back on to talk about something else. So
yeah, I'd love that.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Thank you both.
Yes, sir. All right, we'll talk later.
All right.
Wonderful. See you.
Bye.